Okay. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm here today to talk about a case that occurred back in 1995. This was, I'll start off by basically talking about the case a little bit. What happened and what we know here about this matter. So, first of all, we're going back to May of 1995. On May 19th of 1995, a body was found, an 82-year-old woman who lived on Longmeadow Avenue in the town of Amherst there in the Edwardsville area. About her body was found in an area between the kitchen and the dining room of her apartment. The apartment was basically a, a home, a single family home that was converted into 4 apartments. There was a basement apartment, there was a first floor apartment, there was a second floor apartment, and there was an apartment in the attic. So there were 4 apartments that were in this one home, which was now a 4-bedroom, a 4-unit apartment area. The victim lived on the second floor, in the second floor apartment. On the day before, on May 18th of 1995, the victim did not go to her usual places. She apparently went to her synagogue every day, and then she did not show up that morning on May 18th. She also has some other appointments that her family and friends knew about that she did not go to. So there was some concern on May 18th, going into the evening of May 18th and the early morning hours of May 19th, that something was amiss. Now, she had been talking about going to Florida at some point. So there were some people, again, family members and friends who said, well, she may have already gone to Florida. We may not, know exactly when she's going to Florida, but let's go check it out. And so they went to her apartment, they being the attic tenant, person who lived in the attic, and the victim's niece. The 2 of them went to her second floor apartment at about noon on May 19th of 1995. They got into the apartment and they found her body lying on the floor, like I said before, in the area between her kitchen and her dining room. The victim was beaten and stabbed multiple times. And as you can imagine, there was blood everywhere. There was also blood that was found in other areas of the apartment, including the victim's bedroom, where it appears that there was a robbery that took place as well. So in addition to a murder, we also had a robbery that occurred. And again, the Amherst police came there as soon as the niece and the attic tenant called 911 and called the police, and they arrived immediately thereafter. There was a long investigation into this homicide. This investigation took well over a year and a half. There were some initial suspects that were identified at the time, and there were additional suspects that were also lumped into the possible suspects. Let's call them possible suspects and put them in that pool. The possible suspect pool consisted basically of every tenant that this landlord had. Like I said before, the victim was an 82-year-old landlord of not only the 3 units in her building, but she also owned numerous other properties in Amherst and in the city of Buffalo that she rented out as well. It was well known that the victim wanted all of her rent payments in cash, and she wanted them delivered to her at her second floor apartment. And so that was known amongst kind of the tenant world of hers. And so it was well known that she had a lot of cash at her apartment. So with that knowledge, the Amherst Police Department put on the list every tenant that she had who would have been a possible suspect due to the common knowledge that she had a lot of cash at her apartment. In addition, there were two other suspects who were non-tenants that were identified. One was an individual who was going through a foreclosure proceeding on one of the buildings that she owned, and there was some contention between the two of them over a foreclosure proceeding. The other was a family member who had borrowed money from her and was not apparently paying it back to her in a timely fashion. So there were multiple suspects that were part of this investigation. Of those multiple suspects was then tenant Renee Lynch. Renee Lynch, who is now 67 years old. At the time, she would have been in her late 30s. Renee Lynch was a tenant of the victim, and Renee Lynch lived on Lisbon Avenue in the city of Buffalo in an apartment that the victim owned. And like I said, Miss Lynch was a tenant. So she was initially in the suspect pool of tenants that were again identified by the Amherst Police Department as possible suspects. In addition to that, while the police were at the scene immediately after the body was found, Miss Lynch called the house, and the Amherst police officer picked up the phone and was talking to Renee Lynch on the phone while they were there processing the crime scene. Miss Lynch gave them her full name, told the police she was her niece, the victim's niece, which was not true. She was not her niece, and was just calling to kind of, quote unquote, check up on her, which obviously raised the eyebrows of the Amherst Police Department. At some point in the year-and-a-half investigation, they honed in on Renee Lynch. And at some point, Miss Lynch gave a confession. She confessed that her and an accomplice, and she identified a male individual who I will not name because obviously he's not been charged. She identified a male accomplice and her, went to the apartment to rob the landlord. And in the course of the robbery, the male accomplice murdered the victim. And Miss Lynch stated that she never touched the victim. She never had anything to do with the murder at all. She was just present for the homicide while they were in the process of robbing the home. And that was the confession that she gave. The confession was corroborated by other individuals who she confessed to, specifically one other individual who was a jailhouse informant who she allegedly confessed to as well, that she did it and was part of this while they were in jail. That's pretty much all the evidence that they had. However, the district attorney at the time prosecuted the case and got a conviction on the murder and on the robbery. Like I said before, the male accomplice, there was never any other corroborating information or evidence against him. So they were unable to charge him at a time. And obviously today we are still unable to charge him because again, there's no corroborating evidence. And now we are, like I said, we're here almost 30 years later. So this case first got on my radar after about a year I was in office. And in 2018, Miss Lynch's lawyers, at this time now, Miss Lynch was still in prison. She was found guilty. She was sentenced to 25 years to life, and she was in jail when I took office on January 1st, 2017. And when this case got on my radar in 2018, about a year after I was in office, she was still in jail. And her defense lawyers now, which is the Innocent Project in New York City, along with local counsel Terry Connors here, they made a motion to court. They wanted additional DNA testing done on materials in the home. And I opposed that motion because we were going to get nothing from any new DNA evidence. Miss Lynch, by her own confession, stated that she didn't touch anything. She came in the apartment. Her accomplice did all the work, and she just stood there. So if you're just walking in the kitchen and you're standing there doing nothing, you're not touching anything, your DNA is not going to get on anything. So there's no point in testing for DNA, additional DNA, because she admitted she didn't touch anything. So I opposed that motion. It was going to glean no new information at all. The judge, however, granted the motion and ordered additional DNA testing done. And as I suspected, none of the DNA came back to her. Not surprising. That's not shocking. I expected that. I expected no DNA to come back to her. But that doesn't mean anything. That's quite frankly useless information because she stated she didn't touch anything. Okay, so now after that was all done, and that motion was in 2018, we opposed that. It took a while to litigate that. So now we're in 2020, and the defense lawyers, the DNA comes back, and they show to me that, hey, her DNA is not there. I said to them, that's not surprising. That doesn't mean anything to me, really, okay? But then they said to me, Mr. Flynn, you need to look at something else. You need to look at the fingerprints that were taken from the homicide. Now, again, the fingerprints obviously have DNA on them, okay, but it's actually a separate issue from the DNA. The DNA doesn't have to be fingerprints, and there was DNA evidence that were not fingerprints, okay? The fingerprints is a separate issue. And they said to me, you need to look at the fingerprint issue here, because we don't think that the Amherst Police Department turned over all the fingerprints. And I said, okay, I'll look into it. And I had my conviction integrity unit look into this issue. On top of that, I told them, by the way, you know what? I want you to look into the whole case. I want you to do a deep dive on the whole case. Let's take a look at this from scratch, from day one, and see what we got here. So we did that. And it turns out that at trial, there were 2 sets of fingerprints that were referenced at trial. Now, again, they weren't admitted into evidence because there was no fingerprints of Renee Lynch. And we knew that from day one. There was no dispute about that at all, okay? Again, she didn't touch anything, all right? So her fingerprints weren't there, all right? So the 2 fingerprints that we knew about, they were not admitted as evidence, but they were referenced at trial during witness examination. So we had those 2 fingerprints, and the defense lawyers knew about those 2 fingerprints. There were also 3 additional fingerprints that were lifted from a vehicle that was found near the apartment. There was a stolen vehicle that was found near the apartment that they took prints from as part of their investigation. It turned out that had nothing to do with the case at all. But those prints were known about to the prosecutors, okay? But they had nothing to do with the case at all. So the DA's office in 1995, now 1996, she was found guilty. The jury trial was in February 1998. So let's say late 90s. In the late 90s here, we had 5 prints. It turns out that there were 17 prints taken. And for whatever reason, the other 12 prints were not found at the misplaced. I don't know what happened, okay? I'll be honest with you, all right? All I know is that 17 prints were taken. Only 5 were given to the DA's office, and the other 12 prints were not. That's a problem. And we uncovered that in our investigation. Even though none of those prints were from Miss Lynch. So the fact that they weren't her prints doesn't mean that she wasn't involved in this crime, okay? Because again, remember, she stated she didn't touch anything, all right? So again, the fact that she didn't show up on the prints, whether they were 17 or 5, is really, a non-issue here. What's at the issue here is that we, the prosecutors, didn't have 12 of those prints. And as such, we did not turn over to the defense 12 of those prints. In addition to that, there was testimony at trial from an officer that said that, take a step back. Of the 2 prints that we had, that we knew about, that we obviously turned over to the defense, those 2 prints were from an outside common area. They weren't from inside the apartment. One of the officers at trial testified that there were no usable prints found or lifted from inside the apartment. And that's simply not true. So there was incorrect testimony at trial, in addition to the 12 prints never being given to my office, not mine, but the prior DA at the time. So that's what we uncovered. That is technically a Brady violation, because we, the prosecutors, are imputed with knowing about everything that law enforcement has. So under the Brady rules, if any police agency has any evidence, even if we don't know about it, we are still responsible for not turning over that evidence. So obviously here, there was no fault on the DA's office here at the time. There was no fault on the prosecutor at the time at all. He didn't know about him. And obviously you can't turn anything over you don't know about. So it was nothing, he did nothing wrong at all, but we are supposed to know. And even if we don't know, it is implied, we're implicated with not knowing. So it's basically the people who are obligated to know about everything. And again, I want to be clear here, all right? I have no proof whatsoever that the then Amherst detective was working on the case purposely did not turn over these prints. That is not what I'm saying at all. I have no proof of that. And it would be unfair for anyone to say that. Things get lost, things get sloppy, things get misplaced. They clearly turned over 5 prints. So it's not, if you're going to purposely hide something, you might, you would probably, it's logical to hide all 17. So they didn't do that, obviously. They turned over 5, but 12 didn't get turned over. And so there is no accusation here, no matter what the defense counsel may say, or anyone else may say. There is no accusation here that anyone in the Amherst Police Department purposely did anything wrong. But that doesn't matter. All that matters is the bottom line. The bottom line is that they should have been turned over. And if they were turned over, we would have then obviously had to turn them over to the defense attorney. And that information could have, in my opinion, created reasonable doubt. Especially when on top of that, you had incorrect testimony that there was no usable prints that were lifted from inside the apartment. And that's not true. There were a number of usable prints that were lifted from inside the apartment. So how this played out was the defense attorney made a motion. They made a motion to set aside the verdict, to vacate the verdict based upon the fingerprints not being turned over to the defense. I did not oppose that motion. And based upon my not opposing the motion, it was granted. And the judge granted the motion to vacate the conviction. That was step one. So now once the verdict now was vacated, now I'm back to square one now. Now I still have a valid indictment, all right? So my indictment is still valid. I now have an indictment, and it's up to me now whether or not I'm going to follow through on that indictment and retry the case. And due to the fact that we are almost 30 years later, most of my evidence is missing, or I can't even use. Missing in the sense that at trial, there were 15 witnesses called. Of those 15, 6 are dead. One more I can't find. 3 have horrible memories and they cannot recall anything. Matter of fact, one of the 3 told my people that he can't even remember testifying at trial. So of my 15 witnesses that I had at trial, 10 of them are useless. And on top of that, 30 years now almost has gone by. Miss Lynch has been released from prison. Before the defense attorney made the motion to vacate the verdict, Miss Lynch was up for parole, and I consented to her parole release a year or so ago. I consented to her parole release, and she was released over a year ago. So she did about 23 years in jail already. And so she's done her time already. Retrying the case would serve really no purpose at all. She's not going to get any additional time. If I retried the case and got a guilty verdict, the judge would just give her time served already. And so there's no point in wasting the taxpayers' dollars and the taxpayers' resources to have another trial here. So earlier this week, I filed a motion to dismiss the indictment. And the judge signed that motion yesterday to dismiss the indictment. And the matter versus Miss Lynch is over. Let me, then I'll take all your questions, obviously. Let me point out a couple of things, though, that I want the reports of this to be accurate. All right. I am not exonerating Miss Lynch. Okay. I am not up here saying that she did not do this. That is not what happened here. Okay. I am saying that I do not have enough evidence to go forward 30 years later. And I am saying that it would be a waste of taxpayer dollars to go forward 30 years later. I did not oppose the motion to vacate the verdict because I recognize that it's problematic that all the fingerprints were not turned over. And I recognize that, and there's no way around that. That's a fact. The fact is there were 12 prints that were not turned over. And that's a given, and that's a problem. On top of the fact that one of the witnesses testified that there were no usable prints taken from the apartment, which was not true. And so that is why I did not oppose the motion to vacate, and it's logistical reasons that I'm not going forward with a new trial. So Miss Lynch was not exonerated. Okay. The defense lawyers who did a great job here. Okay. Mr. Connors is one of the finest attorneys, not only in Buffalo, but in the state of New York. The Innocence Project, they do good work. And I respect the job that they do. Even though I disagree with them on a lot of things, I respect their mission. I respect them as an institution, and I respect the job that they did here in this case. However, their portrayal of this matter through their press release